Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back once again to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. We've hit the ground running in 2020 already, and the frontline workers who make up most of the workforce around the globe are busier than ever after the holiday season break. And yet these workers are often not considered in discussions about work-life balance, career growth, employee experience, creative benefits, and the list goes on and on. Because currently, most management advice about work-life balance and employee experience is geared towards those that don't actually have to be present at their job. So for this reason, this group of workers is often referred to as the forgotten workforce. And I first became aware of this particular topic in, I think it was November last year, and released a new book called Being Present. And it was a practical guide to transforming the employee experience of your frontline workforce. And essentially, the book was a collection of guiding ideas, advice, and best practices focused on improving people's lives at work, specifically lives of frontline workers. So with all that in mind, I invited Joyce Moroney, the Executive Director of the Workforce Institute at Kronos, onto the podcast today because I thought it would make a great prescriptive discussion about how organisations can be more creative to transform that employee experience for the forgotten workforce. And yes, this is a tech show, so what I mean by that is also highlighting the importance of keeping your people on top of mind when you're investing in employee-friendly technology. Not to mention focusing on cultivating culture and driving employee retention and engagement and all those wonderful things. And as regular listeners will know, this is a topic that's very close to my heart because it is about tech, but it's also about the people behind it all. So come with me all the way to Salem in Massachusetts so we can speak with Joyce Moroney, the Executive Director of Workforce Institute at Kronos. So a massive warm welcome to the show, Joyce. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Sure, absolutely. So my name is Joyce Moroney. I'm the Executive Director of the Workforce Institute at Kronos. The Workforce Institute is a think tank of human resources experts who publish content. We do surveys, we do webinars, we do use all kinds of different channels to publish information that HR practitioners in particular, but leaders in general, should find helpful when it comes to managing their workers and giving them a great experience. I think the kind of unique angle for the Workforce Institute is that we have always focused our attention on workers whose jobs require presence. So think about firefighters and emergency workers and nurses and teachers, et cetera. We do address sort of the salaried white-collar workers as well, but there's an awful lot of good advice out there for them and not always quite so much for workers who are more tethered to a place and time when it comes to improving their workplace experience. I have been in the high-tech industry for about 37 years, and the majority of those years in the HR technology space. So that's my background.
Excellent. I believe you're a fellow podcaster as well. You got your own podcast, is that right?
Yes, well, I thank you for the opportunity to do a shameless plug. You can find the podcast and our survey results and blog posts, et cetera, at workforceinstitute.org. And the podcast is Workforce Institute Radio. All of those recordings are on the Workforce Institute site. They're also on iTunes under Workforce Institute Radio.
Excellent. And one of the reasons I was excited to invite you on the podcast today was to talk about how we're becoming increasingly obsessed with technology and the shiny allure of any new tech solution. But in doing so, we're often neglecting what many call the forgotten workforce. So can you expand on the scale of this problem and also why most management advice about work-life balance and employee experience is actually geared towards those who don't actually have to be present in their job?
Well, yeah, absolutely. This is the reason that we started the Workforce Institute was our observation that, and we started in 2007, so we've been at this for a while, was our observation that much of the very good advice that's put out there to help people have more balanced lives and have a better experience at work assumes that worker can do that job, at home on a laptop. And while that is true for a lot of jobs, it's not true for the majority of workers who, as I mentioned before, need to be present to do their jobs. And so we look for strategies. We also look for insight from employees themselves via probably about a dozen surveys that we'll do a year to understand what are the benefits that are going to matter most to folks who have to be present to do those jobs. And so while a police officer can't do their job on a laptop, a police officer is going to appreciate scheduling flexibility so that they can take care of their lives outside of work. So that would be one example of the kind of thing we would talk about.
Fantastic. And for everyone listening to this podcast, can you tell me a little bit more about how the Workforce Institute, the Workforce Institute at Kronos, and the kind of problems that you're actually solving for people out there as well, just to help them understand the difference you're making?
Sure. So Kronos is a workforce management technology company. So I work for Kronos, and my job at Kronos is the Workforce Institute. And Kronos itself is about a $1.5 billion global tech company. And our technologies are used for things like employee timekeeping, but also employee scheduling and providing our customers with analytics that help them understand when, where, how much people are working. And so when I started the Workforce Institute, it was with the aim of digging more deeply into the business issues that are unique to organizations who need to manage employees who may be very far flung in terms of where they work, who may have their move between different locations, who may be paid even different rates of pay depending on what kind of work they're doing. So these are complicated human resources issues. And back in 2007, we did a big web search to say, are we, just adding one more HR blog to the world? And at that time, we looked at 700 or 800 blogs that seemed to be likely candidates to give advice about what you're referencing as the forgotten workforce. And we found exactly one example of an ongoing repository of information that was at that intersection of jobs that require presence and technology. So we felt like we were filling a niche that wasn't being very well addressed at the time. And even now, you're going to find a lot more advice on the web when it comes to improving employee experience that assumes that sort of telecommuting as a solution. And often that's the lead solution that's being proposed. And yet the majority of workers in the world can't do their job on a laptop remotely. So that's not helpful to them.
And late last year, the Workforce Institute at Kronos also released a book called Being Present, which is dubbed as a practical guide for transforming the employee experience of your frontline workforce. So can you tell me a little bit more about that book and how it addresses all the issues that we've just talked about?
Yeah, so this is actually the fourth book we have published since we launched in 2007. And all of these books, including Being Present, are anthologies written by, edited by myself and some of my colleagues. But the contributors are all human resources practitioners and thought leaders from around the world. So we have about at any given time between 30 and 40 advisory board members in China, in Europe, in the Americas, who contribute articles to our blog, who contribute insight to our surveys, et cetera. And so we wanted to write a book that drilled a little more deeply into specific issues that we know are important for hourly workers. And so this ranges from workforce development ideas and thinking about, for instance, especially here in the US, the cost of education is sky high. And for a long time, a 4-year college degree has been an assumed credential that is the sort of, gold standard of what people should be shooting for once they're coming out of high school. And in fact, a 4-year college degree has gotten obscenely expensive in the United States. People are, edging into retirement and still paying student debt. And so we explored different ways in which people might pursue alternative types of credentials or alternative types of educational paths that may still lead them to very, very good jobs, but without this crushing financial debt of a college degree. I mean, the other thing in the U.S. especially is that there's been so much focus on 4-year college degrees that we have plenty of examples in the trades, skilled trades, whether that's manufacturing or agriculture or people, supermarkets need butchers, these kind of things. There's almost been a disdain for some of these trades over the last generation or two, with the result that a lot of organizations are really struggling to fill those types of jobs. We have a couple of experts in government on our board, and it's getting increasingly difficult to coax people into government when, and a lot of the government employees are retiring. They tend to be an older workforce cohort to begin with. So we really try to get specific about what kinds of strategies might help with those kind of issues, with how do you make flexible scheduling work when you need 24/7 coverage in a business operation. So it's those kind of things, and it's a marriage of leadership practice and technology and thinking differently about the processes through which work gets done. All of those things contribute to creating a better employee experience.
And I'm curious, do you have any businesses that you work with that have adopted this more employee-friendly technology and focusing on cultivating culture and driving employee retention and engagement? Is there any stories that you can share around that?
Well, we're seeing this. I mean, by the nature of our business at Kronos, we have the luxury of talking to a lot of different organizations about what their goals are and what their expectations are for how technology in particular is going to help them. And I would, I need to be a little careful about not telling stories about organizations that haven't given us permission to do so. Yeah. But what we are finding is that generally, and there are some recent examples that, we've actually published about publicly, so these would be okay to talk about. Things Remembered is a retailer in the United States. Woodbine Entertainment Group is a Canadian company that runs horse racing and casinos. And we have examples in government, in manufacturing, in healthcare. But I would say there are general themes of what organizations are struggling with when they come to us for help. And part of that is that employee-facing technology in companies is often kind of the cobbler's shoes, right? So you may have a company that's got a great technology presence looking out to its customers or stakeholders, but you've got employee tools and technology that, still look like, Donkey Kong, And so what we find is that, and this is, of course, very different than 10 or even 5 years ago, most people irrespective of annual income, are walking around with internet access in their pocket via a smartphone. So I would say that a lot of the innovations that we have made in our solutions, and certainly that we see in our market, is making an employee's life easier by way of incorporating, allowing them to access their employee data and systems through that smartphone. So a couple of examples. So these are sort of general examples that I'm sure that the customers I mentioned are using, but generally speaking, it's things like, instead of having to come into work and look at a schedule on a bulletin board, they can use their smartphone to see their schedule. But more importantly, they can use their smartphone to do things that help them manage their life, like swap a shift with a colleague. All of a sudden, my child is sick, or a party's come up on Saturday night. And if I can use technology to swap my shift with somebody else, and the intelligence behind that application can do the screening to say, is this okay? Is this going to push this person into overtime? Does this person have the credentials to do this job? That makes it a lot easier for that employee, for their manager. And it may sound like a little thing, but it's not a little thing if you don't have a babysitter to watch your kid while you drive into work to, check the thing on the bulletin board or talk to the boss. So, that would be an example of a way that an employer can make the job easier for the employee. On the employer side, and this is certainly true in the U.S., but it's true in most developed countries in the world. There are a lot of labor laws, and they can be national or local or provincial or state, or when it comes to the United States. So complying with labor law when it comes to, are people being paid properly? Are they being paid overtime when they're eligible for it? Are we complying? I know in the United States, different states have different laws about things like breaks and meal times and stuff like that. These are complex problems to manage if you don't have good systems to manage them, because when the compliance agency comes knocking, whether that's a union or whether that's the law, you're going to want to be able to produce those records. So that's a big part of it, is remaining compliant with whatever guidelines or laws are in place where you operate, but it's doing it in a way that's employee friendly. And really, number one for employees is generally having the flexibility to lead their lives outside of work. And we saw this was not our research, but we saw some research last year where this was American, I believe. I don't think it was international, where employees said that having schedule flexibility, they would trade up to 9% of their annual income in favor of having employee flexibility. So the flexible schedules was worth a 9% increase in their base salary. So we thought that was kind of interesting. The other thing we're seeing in general is that you've got an increasing cohort of younger workers in the workforce. So millennials and Gen Z are both bigger cohorts right now than Gen X and certainly the boomers as we're retiring. And these are workers who are used to having consumer grade technology at their fingertips. So here they are, planning a trip to Hawaii or whatever. And that might take them a half an hour to do. But then that process of asking for time off, might take much longer and might require going into work or picking up the phone and talking to the boss. And again, they're used to being able to do pretty complex transactions through their smartphones. So that's part of it, is using technology smartly to support employee-friendly policies. So I don't want to make this sound like it's all about the tech. It's really all about culture and an attitude towards employees, which we're seeing in a lot of organizations now, because with very low unemployment in a lot of countries now, leaders are getting smarter, and more focused on actually making investments in making themselves a great place to work versus just talking about it.
Absolutely. And I suspect there's going to be a lot of business leaders and employers listening, giving some kind of epiphany right now. So for those people, do you have any advice about how their organizations can be more creative and transform the employee experience for this forgotten workforce that we're talking about?
Yeah, I think it starts with having a legitimate and sincere commitment to making that employee experience better. So, I don't know if this is an international expression, but, versus putting lipstick on a pig.
Yeah.
So, you can have the most beautiful employee branding web presence in the world, but if there's nothing behind that, employees know that they have channels now like Glassdoor to blast out their negative opinions about your environment. So one big trend I've certainly seen, even just in the last 10 years or so, is an increasing focus on what can we actually really do to be employers of choice. And it's not about machines. It's not about ping pong tables. It's about starting with understanding what does our culture need to be and need to support in order for us to be successful. And I think a lot of companies, they kind of set it and forget it. And you have a culture, whether you're deliberately trying to shape that culture or not. But as the world changes around us, and whether that's changes in technology, changes in the competition in your industry, changing in the extent to which your organization is global, these external factors are changing around you. You need to be able to respond to that. And your culture needs to be designed in a way that you are attracting and retaining the kinds of talent that you need now and in the future. And that is not something you can just, pick up a rule book and follow. That's unique to every organization. So that's typically a multi-year process to start with really thoughtful assessment of your current culture. And I'll give you an example. At Kronos ourselves, we've gone through a massive HR transformation in the last, let's say, 5 to 6 years, based on the fact that for us, we were moving from being an on-premise software company to a cloud software company. And that's not just a product transformation that's required. Every system, every process in our company was predicated on the understanding that software would be manufactured and conveyed to the customer for the customer to operate. So everything from engineering to billing had to be changed. And there was a realization that our leaders, 600 or 700 leaders around the world, had never really had a cohesive training about what was expected from a Kronos manager. And so the organization spent a year or more just making that clear before we then moved on to educating managers, before we then, and educating managers to identify and support a set of principles in their day-to-day jobs. And in fact, we went even a little further. Lots of companies do this. I think the piece we did that's a little different, and that sounds kind of scary to people when we say we do it, is we have something called a manager effectiveness index. And twice a year, managers are evaluated by their employees and their boss, and a score is calculated from those survey responses. And people are given essentially a heat map of here's where you're doing well according to your employees in supporting these principles, and here's where you need some development. And that has been an incredibly powerful tool because managers know what's expected of them. Employees know that managers are supposed to be adhering to a certain set of principles, as are the employees themselves, and that corrective action will be encouraged and corrective action will be taken if managers are not making a sincere effort to improve in the areas where they are not as strong. So I think the bigger lesson there too is you can't just say you're doing stuff. You have to measure whether stuff is having an impact or not. And through all of this transition, we have just continued to grow our employee engagement scores. So our employee engagement scores in our most recent survey were something like 88, 89% of employees are fully engaged at Kronos. But this didn't happen overnight. This was as I said, probably a 5 or 6 year process. But if you don't have a culture that's going to support your achievement of your corporate goals, then anything else you do is really not going to be successful. But once you have that culture, which gives you that firm foundation of a place where people want to work, then investing in the tools that they need to do their jobs and investing in the kinds of benefits that they care about are going to make you that much more magnetic as an employee. So again, in our case, we have an increasingly younger workforce. We are investing more in benefits like student loan debt consolidation, making contributions to people's student loan, providing maternity leave for the non-birth parent of a child. So these are the kinds of things that, we learned were more important than, say, ping pong tables from our employees.
And it's so refreshing to hear just that, because I think all too often we hear about how legacy technology and legacy applications are holding businesses back, but not enough about how legacy thinking is equally as damaging. So I'm curious again, what do you think the secret is to challenging that yesterday's mindset and, well, we've always done it this way, while also strategically looking forward at the future of work?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it always comes back to metrics, because otherwise it's just my opinion. Mm-hmm. So I think that, you can coast by for a long time, doing things the way we've always done them. And I will tell you that as we made this transition from on-premise to cloud, there were plenty of times that it was very painful and people were very worried about changes to their jobs and changes to processes that they were very familiar with, and whether or not they were going to make it in the new world. And that, that's a very individual thing. For some people, it's super exciting, but for other people, it's quite frightening. And I'll tell you one without naming any names. I was responsible for rolling out a global customer community on Salesforce for our company a few years ago. And I remember being in a meeting very close to the end of the process, and a person who had been at Kronos for a very long time, double digits, and had been in charge of a particular process and was very well regarded and very just a very adept person, was literally on the verge of tears as we were talking through what, from my perspective, were sort of some final details. And I realized that, I was significantly underestimating the fear that people had about making this enormous change, because this thing that they have been very good at for a long time is being severely challenged. And, I was able to reassure this person on the basis that you look how successful you are now. You'll do this thing 50 times and you'll be the expert again. So just give yourself the space to do this thing 50 times. And I think that you have to be sensitive when you're challenging legacy thinking. It's not all a steady vertical climb. There are going to be setbacks. There are even going to be people who actively sabotage what you're trying to do. But I think if you set your goals realistically, I mean, this is all change management 101, have realistic goals, make the appropriate investments to achieve the goals, involve the people who are going to be affected by the change intimately throughout the process, and measure your progress along the way, and continue to measure over and over and over again as you move forward so you can refine. I mean, but you got to have the discipline to stick at it. It's like losing weight. You can't just say, I'm going to lose weight. You actually have to do the work. to measure.
Yeah, always.
It's pretty clear if you're losing weight or not. Yeah.
Yeah, you can only improve what you measure, certainly. And another question I wanted to ask you is around Gen Z who are now entering the workplace, because although there's a bit of an obsession with the millennials in the media over the last 5 years, millennials are now heading into middle age. So what does Gen Z expect at work, and how can a business or how can a business be an employer of choice for those Gen Z employees?
Sure. Yeah, we did a big global study of Gen Z about a year ago, and you can find all of the results at workforceinstitute.org. There were a couple of big findings, perhaps some more surprising than others, but one of the biggest was that I'm going to say about 34% of Gen Z folks, so 16 to 24 years old in the case of our study, cited anxiety as their number one concern about something that would hold them back from being successful at work. And the next couple of findings were things like, I don't have much of a network. So I think somebody might have said, I don't have much of a network 30 or 40 years ago, but I don't think they would have said anxiety was their number one concern. So I think, and in fact, we were so surprised by that finding, we looked at other like psychological research and political research, et cetera, to say, is this some aberration or does this hold up with other people's research? And it does seem to be a theme with Gen Z that their level of anxiety about work and in the workplace exceeds that of their older coworkers. So I think that's something for leaders to be aware of. And this was a global finding. So, this may not just be about, American snowflakes. This is a bigger finding at least across the countries that we surveyed. And I think it points to the importance of, most organizations will have some level of mental health benefits now. And these Gen Z folks, they're also more open about asking for help. So that's the good news. But just being aware that there's all of this stuff going on in the world that we're all talking about all the time. I'm looking at you, Brexit.
Never mention the B word, Joyce.
Yeah. And we obviously have huge challenges of our own in the U.S. We all have to be concerned about, global issues like climate change. So there's a lot of scary stuff going on in the world and uncertainty. And it would appear that it's hitting Gen Z disproportionately. So I think that's a thing for employers to think about is, if we have mental health programs, we should make sure, especially sure that our employees are aware that these resources are available and not stigmatize people who take advantage of them. So I thought that was one interesting finding. The other thing is we found that, again, across the world, Gen Z folks valued having meaningful work as much as they did income. So, income or pay is the number one, the number one factor they're looking at when choosing between employers, et cetera. But having meaningful work to do and also work that's enjoyable. So, work can be meaningful and not always enjoyable, but meaningful work was tied with salary as a top reason to work for an organization. And I like to point out that meaningful work doesn't have to mean you're curing cancer, although that's really cool if that's your work. But it does mean helping younger workers in particular connect what they do to a bigger purpose. So if you're 18 years old and you're, neatening the sweaters on the, display rack on a sales floor, that might not feel particularly meaningful. But if that's reframed by a leader to that employee as, hey, of course we want to make money here, but we also want to give people a really nice experience when they walk in their store. And so really our mission is about making the people who invest some time in our store happier, being a bright spot in their day. We're helping them make a decision that's going to improve their lives, if even in a small way. There's ways of reframing the work that help people see the bigger picture that they're a part of. So that's what we believe is meant when people are thinking about the meaning of their work. They don't want to just feel like they're a human drone doing some task over and over again that nobody cares about.
And what about the latest trends in technology? Is there's so much hype and overkill out there, but is there any particular tech trends that particularly excite you at the moment?
For me, I have been in tech for 37 years. So if I were, I could excite myself to death. But I think that the artificial intelligence. I know a lot of people are going to say this. I think artificial intelligence is going to continue to morph, but maybe in somewhat different ways. I think a lot of people they're concerned about artificial technology becoming, or artificial intelligence becoming like Skynet, and Terminator, where the computers take over the world. I'm not concerned about that. I think, there's a lot of applications out there already of artificial intelligence essentially augmenting management decision making, or artificial intelligence helping us to make sense of these universes of transactional data that organizations have. And I think artificial intelligence can be huge in a business environment to help make connections that, frankly, a human being just isn't going to make, grinding away at a spreadsheet for the next 3 years. But artificial intelligence can detect patterns that would take human beings a really long time to decipher. So I think technology that helps us make more sense of data that we already have, because we have had so much technology in the workplace for decades. I think that's very promising. And of course, it's promising in science and medicine. And again, it's finding those trends in data that we already have, but might be kind of beyond our ability to make sense of. I think the other thing is we're seeing more and more mobile technology in particular that can really change people's lives. So, this is beyond the kind of software industry I'm in, but there's a lot of interesting things going on in medicine in particular, where, the mobile phone itself or the smartwatch can capture insights about in predicting things like an epileptic seizure or schizophrenia exacerbations or that kind of thing, just based on people's behavior as measured by their mobile devices. So I think that's incredibly exciting and important. And lots of people might listen to that and say, oh, it's also kind of big brotherish. So I think it's also going to be true that people, whether it's at work or in their private lives, are going to have to make decisions about the trade-offs between privacy versus the convenience or the benefits that they're going to get from tech as we continue to move forward on this artificial intelligence track. But I am much more excited about artificial intelligence than I am afraid of it.
Well, I cannot thank you enough for coming on the show today. I'm conscious for everyone listening, we've covered a lot of ground today, from research, study, a book, and podcast, and so much more. So before I let you go, could I ask that you remind everyone listening of where they can find you online and contact you or your team if they have any questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find the Workforce Institute at workforceinstitute.org. You can find us on Twitter at WF_Institute. Through workforceinstitute.org, you can, there's an email contact form right there on the site. That's also where you can find our podcasts and all our new content. So I would certainly encourage you to subscribe to the blog, workforceinstitute.org. And for anyone who listens to this podcast and would like a free copy of a free e-copy of our new Being Present book, I would be happy to share those credentials with you. So if you just use the contact me form at workforceinstitute.org and request an ebook, I would be happy to provide you with that information.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again for coming on. When we're talking about culture and things like that, I think there's so many businesses out there that think it's as simple as buying the beanbag, ping pong and foosball table, set and forget it. So it's been so great just to be able to delve deeper into that with you today. And after 37 years in technology, one, you don't sound old enough, and two, have you managed to remain so sane and level-headed after that long in the crazy world of tech? I don't know how you do it.
Well, I have worked everywhere from the IBM Corporation to an internet startup, and you find lessons and different challenges wherever you are. But I would say, I will be retiring within a year, and I have had the great privilege of being in the tech industry through some very, very significant developments and working for some really great companies. So, I mean, it hasn't all been, sunshine and roses for 37 years. But I have had a lot of great adventures and worked with a lot of wonderful people. So I know sometimes the tech industry takes a bit of a bashing these days for, some legitimate reasons and some not so legitimate. But I would have to say that I think working in technology, you have to stay young and you have to stay interested, and that's really it. It's having a curious mind and being excited about learning new things.
Completely agree with you. Well, promise me you'll let me know a few weeks before you retire. We'll get you back on the podcast, give you the send-off you deserve. But more than anything, just a big thank you for coming on and joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much.
What a great conversation about being present and how the individuals who must be present every day at their jobs, who, let us not forget, make up the majority of the global workforce, are not as frequently considered in discussions about work-life balance, employee experience and creative benefits. And I think challenging yesterday's mindset while also strategically looking at the future of work is a no-brainer. And the book that Joyce mentions there offers an eye-opening insight on the positive outcomes for employees who actually invest in their workers' experience. So please, anyone listening, I urge you to take up Joyce's offer there and contact her and get hold of that e-copy of the book and let me know what you think. So a big thank you to Joyce for raising this crucial topic and starting that conversation on this podcast that I don't think enough people are talking about. And hopefully we've changed that today. But it's time for me to pass the virtual microphone over to you. If you've got any thoughts about anything, having listened to our conversation there, or equally, if you listened to this a couple of weeks ago and you've just got hold of Joyce's book and you've just consumed that too, and you've got a few additional talking points, whatever it is, please email me techblogwriter@outlook.com, tweet me at Neil C. Hughes, or pop by my website techblogwriter.co.uk. And we'll keep that conversation going. So I'll return tomorrow with another great guest and we'll tackle another topic together. So all that's left for me to say is thanks for listening, and until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.